On the 30th of January, 1649, the King of England was led out onto an execution scaffold, where an unknown executioner and axeman would be waiting for him. King Charles I was the man who lost the English Civil War, and he had plunged his country into the deadliest conflict ever fought on English soil. And he went to war with Parliament. Charles would ultimately be tried and then condemned by a number of judges, and even his biggest enemy, Oliver Cromwell, signed his death warrant. But then, following the execution, the question came as to what to do with the remains of Charles I and his body. This was a big issue for Parliament, as they did not want Charles's remains to become venerated by people, and they did not want his remains being dug up by their enemies. However, the tomb of King Charles I would be opened by a curious man, and what he found was rather shocking and disturbing. Charles I, on the day of his execution, walked under guard from St James's Palace to the Palace of Whitehall, and a large execution scaffold had been built in front of the crowds and the banqueting house. This was large enough for everyone to see the king lose his head, and the king would be separated from the crowds by a large number of guards, and when he climbed through the window of the banqueting house onto the scaffold, he tried to make a speech to the crowd. He claimed that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. He also said, "But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." At around 2 p.m, the king placed his head on the block after he said a prayer and told the executioner he was ready as he stretched his arms out, and in one swift strike the head of the king was taken clean off. It was said that the crowd emitted a moan, as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. And some people dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood of the king as a souvenir. It was common for the severed head of a traitor to be shown to the crowd, and the words, "Behold the head of a traitor," being omitted, but this did not happen. And then, following his execution, the king's head and body were taken away and were then kept inside of a room, when a doctor then allegedly sewed the head of King Charles back on to his body. And then the king's remains were embalmed and were placed inside of a lead coffin. But, following the execution, the question about where to bury the king's remains, and the commission refused to allow Charles to be buried with other kings and queens at Westminster Abbey. And this was as there were concerns that the king's remains would be disinterred by his supporters, and that he would be venerated as a martyr. But because of this, Parliament then made the decision to bury the executed king in private rather quickly. His coffin was taken under the cover of nightfall on the 9th of February 1649, and it was taken to Windsor, and specifically Windsor Castle and St George's Chapel. Moving the king's remains out of central London was said to have been safer, and Windsor was much quieter for the burial. They believed this would be done in secret, and then this would not attract the same level of intrigue. But the specific place of Charles I's burial would be in the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife. This was found under the choir, and the body was lowered in there. But this grave would allegedly be lost to time over the centuries. However, this was not the end of the remains of King Charles I, as they would be broken into, and the tomb of the executed king would be opened. For many years the exact place of the king's burial following his execution was doubted, but it was described by one of the grooms of Charles I's bedchamber. Charles II, the executed king's son, had dreamed of finding his father's body and then building a large mausoleum where he could be interred somewhere spectacular. It was known that he was buried inside of St George's Chapel, but building work had occurred in the chapel, and this led to Charles I's coffin being lost. However, in 1813, There were alterations being made to the choir of the chapel, and an opening was made which discovered the vault in which Henry VIII's body had been placed, and beside the coffin of the Tudor king was the coffin of King Charles I. The Prince Regent, the future King George IV, would offer the coffin of Charles I to be opened, and this was done on the 1st of April 1813 in front of the presence of the Prince Regent and others. It was Sir Henry Halford who examined the body of the king and broke into his coffin, and then he described what he saw. He even made a drawing of the king's decaying head. When the pall was removed, a plain leaden coffin with no appearance of being enclosed in wood, bearing the inscription King Charles 1648 was uncovered. A square opening was made in the upper part of the coffin lid, and it was found that the internal wooden coffin had decayed badly, and the body of King Charles I had been wrapped in many layers of cerecloth, and in the folds of the cloth a mix of resin had been applied, and this melted and dissolved in the air. But the coffin was completely full, and the cerecloth caused problems with detaching the remains from the coffin and unwrapping the body. It was said that, at length, the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye, in the first moment of exposure, was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately. At the point beard, so characteristic of the period, the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval, many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the untouchous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it is also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead, an eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and to linen which touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were considerably substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back of the part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. When the head was held up, it was said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebra was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could only have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This confirmed that Charles I had lost his head by a sharp axe handled by a skilled executioner. It was then said that, following this examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again, and the vault closed. It is believed that the man who opened the coffin, Sir Henry Halford, did take a souvenir for himself, and it was said he would at dinner parties show off the fourth cervical vertebrae. of King Charles I. But this opening of the executed king's coffin did show a number of things. It confirmed where Charles had been buried, and it also showed that the king had his head cut off by a sharp instrument such as an axe. It was found that the thread which had been used to secure his head back onto his body had dissolved, and that the king's head had fallen. But this was just one case of Charles I's remains being broken into, and today he still is buried inside of the same vault under the floor of the choir in St George's Chapel. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.